Today I want to talk about morphic resonance, which is a fascinating theory suggesting that memory is inherent within nature. If this theory is true, then it will drastically shift how we understand nature and reality to work, and it also has some really interesting spiritual implications. So in this video I want to explain the theory of morphic resonance to you and go over some of these more spiritual aspects of it. My name's Georgia. I just finished studying a master's degree in consciousness, spirituality and transpersonal psychology, and in my free time I love to study the links between science and spirituality. Now, this video is very relevant to what I've been studying because for my master's dissertation, I actually studied morphic resonance. I was doing a study trying to test the theory, basically, and I actually had the pleasure of having Rupert Sheldrake himself, who created the theory, supervise me. So for the past year, I've been going really deep into morphic resonance, and I still am because we're still actually carrying on the study, so my life at the minute is very embedded within morphic resonance. So in today's video, I want to explain the theory of morphic resonance to you because it is such a fascinating theory and it's definitely worth learning about, and then I'm going to touch on some of the spiritual implications that come from morphic resonance. So what is morphic resonance? The overarching theory is essentially that there is a field of information or memory within nature that influences the development and behaviour of organisms based on past experiences. The idea is essentially that once a pattern occurs in nature, the more likely that pattern is to occur again. And the more times that pattern occurs, the stronger its influence becomes. Now, the patterns I'm talking about can be physical, so the physical shape of an organism, for example, but they can also be non-physical, so these patterns can refer to patterns of behaviour or patterns of mental activity. Morphic resonance affects all of these different patterns. Now, to understand how morphic resonance works, we need to understand something called a morphic field. So essentially what Rupert Sheldrake suggests is that around every self-organising system there is a morphic field. Now when I say a self-organising system, these can be living organisms such as humans, animals, plants, but they can also be things such as atoms and molecules, anything essentially which self-organises. All of these organisms or systems, Sheldrake suggests, are surrounded by a morphic field. And the idea is that these morphic fields help organise the system, they help guide them towards patterns of activity. Now, these morphic fields are hierarchical in nature, so they exist at all different levels within a system. So if we take a human being, for example, the human being as a whole will have a morphic field, but the organs will also have a morphic field. The tissues will have morphic fields. The cells within the body will be organised by morphic fields. And so on, it goes down to the molecules and the atoms, the subatomic particles. So at all of these levels, there are different morphic fields guiding the activity at each of the levels. Now, the key feature of morphic fields is that they have an inherent memory, and it's this memory that forms the basis of the theory of morphic resonance. The idea is that morphic fields store information based on past occurrences, and organisms or any self-organising system can tune into this information, and this is what influences them, whether it be again their physical form or their behaviour or mental activity. So there's basically this feedback loop where organisms contribute to the information within the morphic field, but they also draw from that information, so it's this two-way process. And the way that an organism tunes into a morphic field is based on similarity. So us as humans, for example, all of us humans will be able to tune into a common morphic field that is relevant to humans because we're all similar to each other. And the same would work for other species, or if we're talking about a non-living self-organising system, so a molecule, for example, the same type of molecule will all be able to tune into the same morphic field. So as these different organisms tune into and draw from the information within the morphic field, that information will influence their own development. And it is this process that is called morphic resonance. Now, this process of morphic resonance leads to another of Rupert Sheldrake's hypotheses, which is called formative causation. Now, formative causation is the idea that organisms are subject to an influence from previous similar organisms. So an organism's present isn't just defined by its genes or its environment, it's also defined by the experience of previous similar organisms, because that experience from past organisms exists within the morphic field from which the present organisms are drawing from. So they're being influenced by that experience which exists within the morphic field. So this influence from the past onto present organisms is called formative causation. So a good way to kind of summarize what's going on here is to think of morphic fields as cosmic blueprints. Just like how a blueprint guides how a house is built, think of morphic fields as a blueprint which guides everything from the way physical organisms or systems develop to how certain behaviours or mental states develop. Morphic fields act like a blueprint for future generations, influencing how they develop, behave, and maybe even think. And morphic resonance is just this process whereby organisms and systems are contributing to and tuning into that blueprint. So to show you how this works, I want to give you the example of physical form. So if you think of any species, all species have a very similar physical form. So think of humans, for example. We all look very similar. We might have, a different hair colour, different eye colour, different skin colour, but we all have a very similar physical form. Now the idea is that the information of our physical form is encoded in the morphic field of humans, and the way that each of us then get that similar physical form is because as we grow, we are tuning into that morphic field, and that information within the morphic field is guiding our development, and so we all end up with this similar physical form. The conventional view of how we get our physical form is through our genes, so the idea is obviously that our DNA guides our development. But one of the slight issues with this is that if you think of our arms and legs, for example, our arms and legs are made of the same materials, and the genes in both our arms and legs are exactly the same. They all have exactly the same information encoded. All that the genes really do is encode the information for which proteins to build. And our arms and legs are made of the same proteins, so the question is, how does one motor turn into an arm and one motor turn into a leg? Rupert Sheldrake would suggest that the answer lies within the morphic field. The information encoded within the morphic field guides the proteins in the arm to turn into an arm and the proteins in the leg to turn into a leg. So again, it's like a blueprint. There is a blueprint within the morphic field guiding how we physically develop so that we all end up with this similar form. Now, as I already touched on, morphic resonance doesn't just apply to physical forms. So Rupert Sheldrake suggests that there are different types of morphic fields. So one of the types is morphogenetic fields, and this is the type that is relevant to physical form. Now, morphogenetic fields was actually a thing that was already developed in biology, again to try and explain how physical forms develop, and this is what actually inspired Rupert's theory of morphic resonance. But in addition to those morphogenetic fields, Rupert suggests that there are other types of fields. So for example, he suggests that there are behavioural fields, which are a type of morphic field which would influence behaviour. He also suggests that there are mental fields, which, as I'm sure you can guess, are supposed to influence mental activity. So let me just give you another example. So let's imagine a crossword puzzle, and lots of people are completing this puzzle. So the more that people solve the crossword puzzle, that information and that solution is going to exist within a morphic field to which other players are able to tune into. So the theory of morphic resonance would suggest that over time, the more people complete a puzzle, then later people to complete that puzzle should be able to arrive at the solution easier. So theoretically, the more people practice a particular skill, according to morphic resonance, that skill should become progressively easier to learn. And there's a lot of kind of circumstantial evidence that seems to indicate that this might actually be happening. Another type of morphic field is social fields. So these guide the behaviour of societies as a whole. So this can be human society, for example, but it can also be societies in the animal kingdom. So for example, if you think of a school of fish, you can have insane amounts of fish which seem to act in such coordination. It's just absolutely incredible if you look into it. So Rupert Sheldrake suggests that the reason these huge groups of organisms are able to act in such coordination is because their behaviour is being guided by a social field. So those are some of the practical implications of morphic resonance. I now want to touch on some of the more spiritual implications on morphic resonance, because it's really interesting how the theory seems to relate to some spiritual teachings that have existed for thousands of years within different traditions, but also some more modern spiritual ideas as well. So the first one I want to talk about is the collective unconscious. So Sheldrake's theory of morphic resonance, and specifically this idea of morphic fields, seems to really align with Carl Jung's idea of the collective unconscious, this idea that there is a shared pool of human knowledge and experience. If morphic fields do exist, they support this idea of a collective unconscious where human thoughts and experiences are able to contribute to and influence the collective consciousness of humanity. And this might mean that practices such as meditation and prayer influence not just the individual doing those actions, but also humanity as a whole through this process of morphic resonance. Now, the second really fascinating implication, which is one of my personal favourites, is the idea that memory might not be stored inside the brain. And this links to the idea that consciousness itself might not be a product of the brain, which relates to lots of spiritual beliefs. Many people with spiritual beliefs hold the view that consciousness is not a product of the physical brain, and so when we die, our consciousness can still go on in some sense because it doesn't die alongside the brain. So this idea is kind of related to that. Morphic resonance suggests that memories don't need to be stored in the brain because instead they would exist within morphic fields and we would just tune into them. This obviously challenges the conventional view that memory is stored within the brain. There's this big search to try and find what's called the physical memory traces within the brain, which hasn't actually been achieved yet. No one currently has a full understanding of how memory works, so Rupert Sheldrake suggests that the reason we can't find these physical memory traces is because they don't exist. Instead, the memory exists within the morphic field. Now, if this is true, it has very interesting implications for spiritual concepts such as reincarnation and ancestral memory, because maybe we're able to access memories that are beyond our lifetime because we're able to tune into these morphic fields. Now, the next implication is that morphic resonance might provide a potential explanation for certain psi phenomena. So this relates to another of Rupert Sheldrake's theories called extended mind, where he basically suggests that our mind can actually physically extend beyond our skull through morphic fields. So he uses this idea to explain phenomena such as telepathy and the sense of being stared at. So in the latter, the sense of being stared at, what he would suggest is that the reason people can sense it is because a person's mind is actually physically extending beyond their brain and touching the other person when they're staring at them. So the person being stared at can actually physically sense that person's mind touching them. Or in terms of telepathy, maybe when someone's focusing on us, we can actually feel their morphic field interacting with ours. So maybe that's why we have telepathic experiences. Another implication of morphic resonance is the interconnectedness of all life. So if morphic resonance is true, then it means that we're all connected by something other than just our genes or our physical environment. We'd also be connected by these invisible fields, and morphic resonance would mean that past organisms of the same species are able to influence us in the present. So there's this connection that extends across both space and time. This aligns with the spiritual idea of oneness, that we're all connected, because morphic resonance suggests that our experiences and our actions can influence others even across generations. Now, the final implication that I want to talk about is spiritual growth and enlightenment. Morphic fields might support the idea that when a person is working towards spiritual growth or reaching new levels of consciousness, then they might contribute to a field that makes it easier for others to reach that same level of awareness. So this kind of connects to this idea of a collective awakening, which you might have heard many spiritual people talk about. This idea that more and more people are going to be awakening in a spiritual sense maybe morphic resonance and morphic fields provide a theoretical basis as to why this might be happening. The more people that wake up, the easier it becomes for subsequent individuals to also awaken in the same sense, because that memory or that information is stored within the morphic field to which these other people can tune in. So spiritual practices like meditation and mindfulness might have a cumulative effect on the collective unconscious, making it easier for other people to achieve the same states of awareness. So just know that if you are practicing meditation or something, you might not only be benefiting yourself, you might actually be benefiting everyone else around you too. So all in all, morphic resonance is really a revolutionary theory that could completely reshape how we understand so many processes within nature. So think of morphic fields as cosmic blueprints, guiding not only the physical world, but also our mental experiences and maybe even spiritual experiences too. And morphic resonance is the process by which we are able to tune into these blueprints. If this theory is correct, then we're able to tune into this inherent memory within nature and even contribute to it ourselves. And essentially this would mean that we're all connected by something much deeper than we all realise. So that's it for today's video. I really hope you enjoyed it. Please give it a thumbs up if you did. Now, if you want to see more content exploring the links between science and spirituality, then you can take a look at some of my other videos. I touch on quantum physics and neuroscience and how all these things relate to the law of attraction, for example. So I hope to see you there.